Annie is a commercial leader for more than 23 years of experience in healthcare industry in Asia Pacific and international market. She spends many years at GlaxoSmithKline Asia Pacific in country, regional and international roles, including being posted in Canada and managing setting up new businesses overseas. 2011, Annie joined Allergan as senior manager of pharmaceutical company, and she ran this business in Asia Pacific, including Japan, China, Australia, and so on and so forth. Annie is a winner of the Women Leadership Excellence Award from CMO Asia in 2015, and she was featured in the Business Times, the Straits Times Singapore. She is a pharmacist by profession, and she holds an executive MBA from ESSEC Business School. She was, at this period of time, and just think about it, she was awarded Best of Class of the ESSEC EMBA. She's also author of the book, Pivot Points, How to Recognize That Things Happen for a Reason. In her book, Annie argues that things happen for a specific reason, and we all have pivot points in our life. So you can understand why Annie is very relevant for this week. Her story is to inspire and encourage readers to recognize the pivot points in their life and embrace this as a sign to uncover something new. Thank you very much, Annie, to be with us today.
Well, thank you very much for the very generous introduction. Good afternoon. How are you all doing today? Fine. So I heard you had a very intense week, but all of you look quite fresh. So that's very encouraging. So I have about 15 minutes. So before I tell you about my journey, I did want to take this opportunity to give you my perspective of the world in transition. So in the first half of my session today, I'd like to give you my take of how I see the world in transition. And then I'd like to close off with my journey, and hopefully it'll be something that you'll find useful and inspiring. But to kick off, I'd like to start off with the video.
This is not a drill. My name is Greta Thunberg. We are living in the beginning of a mass extinction. Our climate is breaking down. Children like me are giving up their education to protests. But we can still fix this. You can still fix this. To survive, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. But this alone will not be enough. Lots of solutions are talked about. But what about a solution that is right in front of us? I'll let my friend George explain.
There is a magic machine that sucks carbon out of the air, costs very little, and builds itself. It's called a tree. A tree is an example of a natural climate solution. Mangroves, peat bogs, jungles, marshes, seabeds, kelp forests, swamps, coral reefs, they take carbon out of the air and lock it away. Nature is a tool we can use to repair our broken climate. These natural climate solutions could make a massive difference.
Pretty cool, right?
But only if we also leave fossil fuels in the ground.
Here's the crazy part. Right now, we are ignoring them. We spend 1,000 times more on global fossil fuel subsidies than on natural-based solutions.
Natural climate solutions get just 2% of all the money used on tackling climate breakdown.
This is your money. It is your taxes and your savings.
Even more crazy, right now when we need nature the most, we're destroying it faster than ever.
Up to 200 species are going extinct every single day.
Much of the Arctic ice is gone. Most of our wild animals have gone. Much of our soil has gone.
So what should we do?
What should you do?
It's simple. We need to protect, restore, and fund. Protect. Tropical forests are being cut down at the rate of 30 football pitches a minute.
Where nature is doing something vital, we must protect it.
Restore. Much of our planet has been damaged.
But nature can regenerate, and we can help ecosystems bounce back.
Fund.
We need to stop funding things that destroy nature and pay for things that help it.
It is that simple. protect, restore, fund.
This can happen everywhere. Many people have already begun using natural climate solutions. We need to do it on a massive scale.
You can be part of this.
Vote for people who defend nature.
Share this video. Talk about this.
All around the world, there are amazing movements fighting for nature. Join them.
Everything counts. What you do counts.
So very strong words from a very young lady, and I'm sure all of you know about Greta Thunberg. So the first slide I want to show you is called thin ice and skating of thin ice, and I hope everyone understands the term skating of thin ice. Now, why am I showing you this as my first slide? There are lots of uncertainties in the world that we live in today, so you will need to be prepared, and it's going to be changing at an even faster pace. The next slide I'm going to show you, paradoxically, is a world on fire. Now you can take this literally. We're seeing extreme weather conditions, as you probably know, from bushfires in Australia to floods in the other end of the world. Now this is really a big problem. One of the reasons I wanted to start off with the video. But if you look at it from a non-literal manner, the world is also on fire because of the massive transformations that's really shaping the world that we live in today. So bear with me as I take you through my next few slides to really make the case about thin ice and the world being on fire. Now, we all know about fossil fuels. Now, there is a growing political tide against fossil fuels. And this is a conundrum. Now, many of you might end up being in this industry. This is a conundrum facing a lot of the oil and gas companies. So much so that there is a big question being asked. Should companies such as the oil and gas companies be focused on maximizing profits, or should they have a wider purpose, right? And it has been shown that in the last decade itself, the capital expenditure in the oil and gas industry has reduced by 50%. In fact, the CEO of Shell, someone by the name of Ben Van Beurden, said recently that Shell is not an oil and gas company. Imagine that. He said Shell is an energy transition company. So even companies are rebranding themselves as being in transition. I'm sure today and this week you would have spoken quite a lot about sustainability. It's a big agenda item, something that's being discussed in boardrooms. It was just a few years ago that in classrooms and in business schools we were just explaining what circular economy is all about. But today, and by the time most of you are in companies and large organizations, this is now a central part of strategy. So there are more and more businesses that are moving into the area of sustainability, and people are willing to pay more for products that use resources in a sustainable manner. Now let's move into some of the different industries. One of the industries that's been most disrupted is how we move, mobility. So we all know that the ride-hailing phenomenon is here to stay. So much so that it has really changed our mindset. It is your generation and the millennial generation that's beginning to think, why should I own a car? Because all I need to do is just pull out my mobile phone and tap for a ride. So it's really changed the mindset of people, and this is one of the major shifts that we're seeing. And there are more and more companies in the ride-hailing space, so much so that their profits are also being squeezed. So what do you do when your profits are being squeezed? You need to think outside of the box. So with the app and the platform, you have a whole host of different services that are being offered. So with your phone, you can get not just a ride, you can get groceries, you can get clothes, and a whole host of different things. Now, this trend is expected to continue, and you might have many of you in this room that will be in one of this business. So it's something that is going to be very interesting. Now, the future of commuting is in autonomous vehicles, right? The technology in self-driving vehicles is already at the final stages. In fact, the companies that are in this space, all this time they've been focusing on how do they refine the technology. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to teach a robot to try and drive a vehicle safer than human. But what the companies have begun to realize is the battleground is now shifting. It's not just about getting the algorithm right, it's about how do you commercialize. Now, some of you might end up being in the commercial world, and maybe you might end up being in this business. So what are some of the issues with commercializing when it comes to autonomous self-driving vehicles? One of the main issues you got to battle with is government regulation. How do you get government support? How do you get public trust? And the brand, how do you get people to trust your brand? And more importantly, how do you take it at scale? So on the one hand, you might have a technology. On the other hand, if you don't think about commercialization, you don't have a business in front of you. Geek economy, I'm sure this was something that you discussed this week. Now, gig economy is so big now that by 2050, it's estimated that 5 billion out of the 6 billion working adults will be in the gig economy. Imagine, and you know what that means. That means your boss is an app or a software. And the world that I entered when I was working was a fairly typical world with hierarchical structures. So when you have a boss who is an app, imagine the kind of interaction. So the number of interactions between human and machines are going to increase, and the interactions between humans and humans is going to increase. Now, the repercussions of this is quite profound, because all of us need to develop and evolve in our working environment. But if your boss is a machine, how does that work? So in your generation and the generation coming after you, you will need to rely quite a lot on professional networks, right? So in business school and in networks that you're building now, and business school alumni, these are very important networks for you to think about, because the world and the working space has dramatically shifted. Let me ask you, who do you think are the world's most powerful consumers today? Anyone? Okay, this is a guess. This is a clue, rather. What does M stand for? So the world's most powerful consumers today are the millennials. And Morgan Stanley has said that the millennials, that whole generation, has reached what they call the economic activity age. What that means is they are beginning to form households, they're getting married, they're having children, they're probably buying their first house. And by the year 2030, it's estimated that the total collective income of millennials around the world will exceed 4 trillion. 4 trillion. So if you are a brand owner, you are leading an organization, if you ignore this huge consumer group, you are in trouble. Now, there's a lot of very interesting data out there in terms of how the millennials are different. We all know, and this is not really a shift, this is really happening, we all know that the millennials use social media a lot more than my generation, Generation X, the baby boomer generation. Over and above that, what is very interesting is to know that millennials also want to have their opinions heard. It's a very important part of how they think and how they feel. In fact, there is some survey to say that they are a lot more anxious than their elders. The other thing that's very interesting about millennials, and I showed you earlier about on the video of climate change, they are particular about issues such as climate change. In fact, I think they're championing it. And they're also interested in issues such as sexual harassment, for example. So why does this matter, and why am I sharing this with you? You might be in an organization where it's important for you to understand these are important shifts that's taking place in the world that we live in today. So for example, and hopefully some of you have read some of this in newspaper reports, if you have a whistleblower in your company, and if you choose to ignore that, you will be amazed, especially if you have a large consumer base that are millennials, you'll be amazed at how fast some of this information can travel and how this will not just affect your brand, but your organization. And one of the interesting things was what appeared in the Financial Times a few months ago on how social media has enabled global protests. And we've got this new phenomenon called leaderless rebellion. So you don't even need a leader these days to start a movement or a rebellion. You just need to have social media. And again, this is very important, whether it's for political reasons or social reasons or economic inequality. We're seeing these messages transmit in a pace that we have never seen before. So again, these are things you might be thinking from a business standpoint, what does it matter? If you have been following the news, for example, in Hong Kong, many brands have been affected because of how they did react or did not react to some of the things that's happening in the political front. So let's come back a little bit to some of the shifts we're seeing in this millennial age. So they are more anxious than their elders. And it's also very interesting, and perhaps some of you might end up being in the hospitality industry. How they travel is different to how perhaps I travel when I first took my holidays. For them, what is more important is the experience. Now, they might go to the normal touristy places, but what is very important is they're spending more time in local bars, in local villages, because for them, what is important is to gain new skill sets and new experiences. Now, it's also been said that the millennial generation can actually disrupt and reshape entire industries. And one industry that has really been upended, as we call it, or disrupted, is the retail business. Why? Because the whole concept of owning has changed. For millennials, for them, if I can share rather than own, that makes more sense to me. So the whole concept of owning assets has changed. And so a lot of the big brands in the retail industries are beginning to try and see how they address this. It's a very difficult shift, but it's something that really will continue to accelerate. And if you're a business owner thinking of new business ideas, this is another space that a lot of young entrepreneurs have gone into, the whole space on rental, because there's a different mindset about owning. How many of you are on TikTok? No? Do you know what TikTok is? You don't. Okay, you do. So of course I'm not on TikTok, and it's apparently a very wildly popular social media site. The reason I'm showing you this is how brands have to adapt to reach out to the millennial community. And this has really further accelerated fragmentation. When I entered the space and started working with brands, we absolutely had a very different sense of what brand marketing is about. And if you end up being in branding, marketing, and commercial and selling in that space, you will need to make sure you understand how to use social media effectively, right? let's talk a little bit about the sharing economy. Now, it's only back in 2008, which is not that long ago, that a few entrepreneurs started this whole concept of sharing economy. Now, this is such a booming industry that you can share almost everything from your house to your car to products you've used. And again, one of the important things and one of the reasons I wanted to show this slide is there is a shifting view about ownership. People are beginning to think that sharing makes a stronger, compelling proposition than owning. And for someone like me who's worked with brands all my life, and when we first started, or at least when I first started doing brand marketing, there was this whole concept about brand essence. And what brand essence really means is the heart and soul of a brand. Now, if the most compelling proposition of a brand is shifting, it really changes the whole scope of brand marketing. So this is not McDonald's burger, this is Impossible Burger. Does everyone know or have heard of Impossible Burger? No? Oh, okay. You don't have Impossible Burger in France, maybe. Okay, so Impossible Burger is a plant-based burger that's becoming very popular. So plant-based diets is now a new trend. So there's also a major shift in the food space in terms of sustainability. And this epitomizes a new trend, a new shift towards healthy living. Now there are two reasons why people are moving towards an animal-free diet. One is because of healthy lifestyle. The other is because there's a growing concern on the treatment of animals as well. So again, if you end up being in this industry, you'll need to think about how there is this strong shift towards a meat-free diet. Does anyone know what this is? Yes? Oh, okay. When it comes to money, you know. Great. What is this? Cryptocurrency, yes. So back in June of 2019, I think it was, Facebook unveiled that they are entering into the digital space with Libra. Why do you think they're doing that? Why would Facebook want to get into it? Well, actually, if you think about it, the whole global payment system, we talked about apps and getting everything from just, tapping onto your phone. If you think about the global payment system, it's still fairly clunky, it's fairly convoluted. So clearly there is a market out there to make digital payments more savvy. Now, the thin ice factor, the risk in all of this is there are concerns around things like tax evasion, possibly money laundering and money going into the wrong hands. So it's a very interesting space to watch. But clearly the future of money as we know it now, hard currencies, that is going to change. Now, how many of you have been to China? Beijing, Shanghai? No, no one? So if you go to Beijing or Shanghai, you might actually see people not even carrying their wallets anymore. Everything is paid through the phone, right? I think the majority of people use either Alipay or WeChat. So this is another area where we are seeing significant shifts in terms of how people are paying for services and for brands. What about traditional media? How many of you still watch television as we know it and programs? How many of you still watch TV? Now, you probably know that one of the biggest disruptions that has taken place in the traditional media space is that of streaming. And so again, if you end up being in this industry, you must know that this has shifted so dramatically, so much so that the big media empires, whether it's Disney or Warner Brothers, they are really fighting with the giant, which is Netflix. And in fact, Apple has also jumped onto the bandwagon, and I think recently even Disney has joined into the bandwagon. What's very interesting in my view is while there's this big competition going on in the streaming world, there's a whole new concept, right? We used to talk about the word binge, we usually associate with drinking, we talk about binge drinking. But now it's about binge watching. I don't know about you, but I was definitely binge watching Game of Thrones. I don't know if you guys follow Game of Thrones, but so much so that it has rewired our brain. And now when we look at content on television, we are evaluating them by how, as we call it, bingeable they are. So if you are in that space, if that's an area of interest to you, you will need to think about how do you create content that will be bingeable. So again, these are shifting trends. Again, you don't know which industry you might end up with, but these are shifting trends that you need to be aware of, because these are major changes that's going to be very, very different from the space as we know it today. Now, the competition is not just happening here on Earth, but also in outer space. Do you know these two gentlemen? Yes? Jeff Bezos, Amazon, and Elon Musk of Tesla. Probably two of the most influential business leaders today. Now, they're making some big bets. The bets they're making is the telecommunications sector is going to have an explosive growth. Why? Because there are large parts of the world, perhaps not all of you here, but large parts of the world that are still not connected on the internet, such as Africa. And the second bet they are making is that they want to really fill the gap and address this opportunity. They're investing in what's called microsatellites, which actually operate at a lower orbit level. So we're not just having a massive competition here on Earth, but also in outer space. Artificial intelligence, probably one of the most profound, revolutionary inventions in the last 2 decades. If you think about artificial intelligence, what we're trying to do, humans are trying to make machine simulate our intelligence, right? So humans are trying to make machine simulate our intelligence. Now, in almost every aspect, so it doesn't matter which industry you'll end up in, artificial intelligence is here to stay. There are raging debates about artificial intelligence, as you know. Will they take over? Will they take on our jobs? Very likely. And the shape of jobs, as we know it today, is going to change forever. One area that artificial intelligence and robotics has really made a huge positive impact is in healthcare, which is a space I'm in. So we are using already, and we've been doing this for the last 5-6 years, not just robotics, but augmented reality, mixed reality, to do surgeries, to train new surgeons. So this is a real dramatic change in how healthcare has moved, and AI and robotics will continue to make a big difference. In the area of cancer diagnosis, I won't spend too much time on this, we're also seeing major technological changes. We are now able, through a technology called liquid biopsy, we are able to tell if you are predisposed to cancer even before you have any symptoms. So there are massive changes from a technological standpoint, driven by AI, driven by robotics, that's making a big positive difference. So that takes me very nicely to talk to you about the next part of what I'd like to share with you, which is my journey in the life sciences industry. Xavier has actually said quite a bit already at the start. So I trained as a pharmacist, and in the first couple of years, as you would as a pharmacist, I worked in a hospital. And after that, I moved on to the retail industry. So in retail, basically, you're seeing patients, consumers directly. In the hospital, you do get to see patients. Now, after a couple of years, I started my long stint in the multinational company, and I worked in a number of different companies. I spent over 2 decades in multinational companies. So this just shows you some of the companies I've been with. Zuellig Pharma is a Swedish pharmaceutical distributor. And with a pharmaceutical distributor, some of the things you pick up in terms of skill sets is how does the business model works in different companies. you talk about supply, demand, how you work with vendors, how you work with wholesalers. So it's quite a useful early education in terms of how the industry works. Then I started my long journey with life sciences companies, GlaxoSmithKline. I actually spent 17 years, which is a very long time. I would not urge any of you to spend that long in any one company. I was lucky because quite early in my career, I had the opportunity to be seconded in Canada, which is that little dot up there. And the stint in Canada was really fairly life-changing, and it's one of the pivots that I talk about in my book. Being in a place that was completely unfamiliar, because I come from a small country called Malaysia, and moving from Malaysia to a country like Canada, which is a very developed country. In fact, it was the most successful international organization we had, was a complete change. So that experience gave me a blast of optimism. I developed this whole skill set of risk-taking and being able to see things from a different perspective, which is a concept which I call lens. So any opportunity you get to work or gain experience in as far away from where you come from is probably the first thing I'd like to encourage you to do. Now, in the many years that I spent in these different organizations, I was fortunate enough to work in various regions. So I covered Asia Pacific, Latin America, Middle East, Africa, Japan and Australia as well. And one of the key things in working in many different places is you meet so many different types of people, systems, models. You see a whole host of different issues. So I worked with doctors from Canada to Turkey to Argentina to Brazil, and they all behave differently, and there's something that you will always learn by trying to tackle the different issues and the different situations that you have to grapple with. So I was lucky to have spent that long a stint in all these different companies and to be given many different roles in many different parts of the world. So this, sorry, let me just go back. So this summarizes all my different roles that I held over the many years that I spent in the pharmaceutical industry. And there are probably three important bulk moments which I show in this slide. The first was when I spent that period of time in Canada being seconded. It was really something that allowed me to think about fertile thinking and how do you become comfortable with the uncomfortable. The second light bulb moment is when I joined Allergan. So GSK, for some of you who don't know, is a very large pharmaceutical company. And you know, with large companies, and it's probably one advice I would give you is, if it's possible, to start your career in a large multinational company, because that's where you probably have a lot more resources within the organization to either move between countries or to really move up the ladder. Allergan was a smaller company, it was an international company. One of the key things I learned moving from GSK to Allergan is that you really had to roll up your sleeves. It was a leaner organization, so if you did well, you got complimented. If you failed, you took responsibility. So that was a big learning in terms of how you think as a business leader, moving from a large organization to a much smaller organization. The third light bulb moment was when I decided to leave the corporate world, which was a very difficult decision, having been in the corporate world for a very long period of time. So moving from the corporate world where you have a very stable income to become an entrepreneur. So in 2017, I left the corporate world and started my company called Vitasign. Later that year, I got inspired from one thing led to another, and I wrote my first book called Pivot Points, How to Recognize that Things Happen for a Reason. Now, Many of you may choose to remain in the corporate sector. Some of you may start off in the entrepreneurial side, from get-go. My pitch to you is, if you do get a chance to experience both, there is really a huge significant learning that I've gained moving from the corporate sector to become an entrepreneur. The disruptions, while this is very unsettling, the disruptions absolutely enriched me and my thinking and gave me a very different perspective of how business works and what are some of the different models out there. And as I wrote the book Pivot Points, I think one of the main things that was very inspiring was being an entrepreneur allowed me to not think of limits and not be confined by boundaries. So you really feel quite unleashed into thinking, what is it that you can do to try and make a difference? So it's a very different space, and I hope at some point it might be something you end up doing as well. So after that, as I set up my company, while I still have my company, I moved into a different space called the incubator space. So I started working with an Israeli-based company where what we do is we bring in startups, so it's a medtech incubator. Then again was a very different experience because you're starting to deal with startups, small companies, and how do you help them to commercialize. The role that I have now, so I've moved on from there, so you can see I've moved through many different roles. The role that I have now, while I still have my company, is I lead up partnerships and joint ventures for a research institution. So the reason why I put up this slide with the globe is I feel that over the course of my journey, I've been lucky enough to be exposed to many different types of business environments and organizations, from the large companies to being an entrepreneur, and also in different business segments. And one thing I'd like to leave with you is, if you do have the opportunity to move through different types of businesses, you might stay in the same industry, but if you do have the opportunity to move across different businesses, that will really give you a whole diverse perspective of what is out there. So allow yourself to grow. Think about every opportunity you can to grow and learn something different. So I talked earlier about the world being on fire. So Carol Dweck is a professor of psychology at University of Stanford. She says in a growth mindset, so while there are a lot of growth opportunities out there, you need to make sure that you are ready to take them on. So challenges are exciting. So think of challenges as something exciting. I talked to you about thin ice and some of the risks and uncertainties that are out there. Jack Ma tells us that the best teacher is when you make mistakes. And this is also something that I personally learned, especially as I moved into being my own entrepreneur. You learn the most when you make mistakes, and absolutely don't be afraid to make mistakes. Sundar Pichai, as you all know, is chairman and CEO of Google. And what's interesting was he was one person who excelled at things that lay outside of Google's comfort zone. And look at where he is now. So in my last few slides, I'd like to leave you with some tips. And hopefully these are tips that you will take away and use that as your own trajectory in terms of how you'd like to move forward. The first is what I call the planet of learning. Having an agile learning mindset is a must, right? Now, one of the things I've learned in all my disruptions is the disruptions has really enriched me. There really is a whole galaxy out there with little planets circulating, rich with experiences and learning opportunities. So really take advantage of this. Lifelong learning is in. The next one I'd like to leave you with is to fall in love with volatility. My experience in Canada tells me that unless you push yourself into unfamiliar territory, you will never learn how agile you are. And I can tell you, without knowing, most of you, if not all of you, are very agile. It's just something that we may not be aware of. The third one is what I call experience with experimentation. Now, the new social currency is experience. So as much as you can get experience, go after it. There is really a richness in the science of experience with experimentation. There's one that I just missed out. The second last one is, I think all of us, because I definitely feel I found it, although I'm still discovering some of it, I think all of us have a hidden vault that is just waiting to be unlocked, right? And you will never uncover it unless you prod or stir it up. So I'd like to urge you, all of you here, you all have a hidden vault. You need to really prod and stir it up because it's waiting to be unlocked. And my final one is to think about your brand. The world is very competitive. Unless you differentiate yourself, you're not going to stand out. So my journey into entrepreneurship has really catapulted my own self into building my brand equity. And all of you need to do that. And you need to sell yourself. So always think about what your brand is and how you're going to sell yourself. My last slide. So as we go into the ring of the new decade, there are going to be lots of opportunities and lots of challenges. If I've left nothing with you, I hope I've been able to at least inspire you to allow growth and be unafraid. And I'll leave you with what Steve Jobs said when he did his commemoration speech in 2005, University of Stanford: stay foolish, stay hungry. Thank you very much.